Well, welcome everybody. We have another interview with a small upcoming British political party. This is the Social Democratic Party, and I'm very delighted to have as my guest the leader of that party, William Clouston. Welcome, William.
Great to be here. Thanks, Bruce.
Well, thank you for doing this. So we have to start with the nature of the party, because for most of our audience, they will think of the Social Democratic Party as a party that was wound down in 1988. So how is it that the party is in existence now? It has your good self as leader and is ready to contest elections in May.
Good question. Well, it never went away. The interesting thing about political parties is that they are effectively voluntary associations, and they are their members. And yes, it's true that it's not widely known that the SDP is still here, but the sort of broad three-line history of the party is that it was started in 1981 by the Gang of Four. Importantly, it was kept alive and separate from the merger with the Liberals in '88 by David Owen, and it continued until 1990 under his leadership. And the third line is that it was kept alive at the grassroots by its members, and it proves a point that if a political leader wants to leave the field and leaves a party with 10,000 members throughout the country, the party can continue on. And actually there were some quite important pockets of SDP membership and council groups in places like East Yorkshire and South Wales, and where they were quite dominant actually. And we had councillor groups until a few years ago in Port Talbot. And we've still got the same branch in the East Yorkshire and Bridlington that existed with the same bank account, funnily enough, all the way back to the 80s. So it's actually quite difficult to remove political parties. So we're still here. The question as to why we've had a resurgence is a slightly different one.
So well, let's get there. First, you mentioned your membership. So can you describe how many members you have and how many of those members would have at least councillor experience?
Well, the membership story is interesting. I'll give you a broad brush of that. In the 80s, the membership went up to about 80,000. Under Owen, it probably went down to about 12,000 in 1990, and then it dwindled basically to very little. I think the low probably was a few years ago, where it was about 100 or just under 100. So it was very, very small. But importantly, in terms of the party's survival, the party's name and the registration with the Electoral Commission and its logo continued. Membership under the resurgence since we published the new declaration, low thousands still, but it's massively up on what it was. In terms of councillor experience, we've got quite a few people who, I mean, I've been a district councillor in the past, the parliamentary candidate twice. So yeah, I mean, we've got original members back to the 80s that have some experience of that. And we've got one or two community councillors and very good candidates lined up for May.
Yeah, so let's talk about some of your prominent members. First, when you talk about those like yourself with councillor experience, would any of them have crossed from other parties? Yeah,
I mean, probably our most prominent political member is Patrick Flynn, who was a member of the European Parliament, and he was elected in the UKIP group previously, and he joined us 2.5 years ago. So there was a nice period of time actually, Bruce, when the SDP had the same number of European parliamentarians as the Liberal Party, as the Lib Dems, which I enjoyed pointing out to people. Yeah. But other prominent members, as most people probably know, Rod Liddell, the journalist, is a prominent member. We have other people that are quite well known in their communities.
Yeah, so this is going to be interesting because people like Rod Liddell are usually characterized as conservative, so they write for The Spectator, and they are certainly anti-woke and these other things that tend to get reduced to the label of conservative or worse, like fascist. Yeah. So this is going to be interesting because your Social Democratic Party in its new form, clearly from its manifesto, from what you've declared already online as a party, I mean, you've got some interesting appeal to conservatives, liberals, and progressives. So I'm very interested to explore that. But let's just finish the story of your capacity, your electoral capacity. So from membership, member count, can you estimate how many candidates you intend to field in the local elections in May this year?
It's very patchy, Bruce. What happens is we're building this up grassroots and regional party up. So there are some very strong regional parties that got ahead quite early, 2.5 years ago, really started growing nicely. So the Yorkshire SDP is very strong. It always has been for some reason. I don't know what's going on there, but they are very strong. And so in cities like Leeds, for instance, we would expect to have a full slate of candidates across the 33 seats in Leeds. They're very big seats, mind you, but that's what we expect there. We may be in the high 20s, but that's what we're aiming for. Other parts of South Yorkshire, very high candidate representation if the elections go ahead. After that, actually, it's quite patchy. I mean, we'll have candidates in the Northeast. I would suspect every single region will have candidates, but as I say, we're stronger in some areas than others.
Yeah, so can I ask you if you're going to stand candidates for police crime commissioners?
We're going to look that very much on the local basis. I mean, we're against police and crime commissioners as a matter of party policy. I think they're just another mistake, really. And so that's a slight hurdle, but yeah, we'll take it on a regional basis. If we have a good candidate with experience, we'll look at it. Okay,
thank you. All right, so let's talk about what differentiates the new SDP, if I can call it that. So your SDP from the old SDP, which after all is a failed party. So it wound itself down. Politically, it was relegated behind its close cousin, the Liberal Democrats. The Liberal Democrats survive in Parliament. The SDP does not. So how would you differentiate the SDP in a marketing sense? So you got to say to the voter, forget what you remember about the old SDP. This is the new SDP is a party you should take notice of.
That's a very good question. I might start off on a positive note. So what are the main things that go back in the chain to 81? I mean, I was involved. My father left the Labour Party, and I joined in 82. I was 15 in 81. I couldn't join, but I joined as soon as I could and campaigned right the way through it. So in looking to have a resurgence, one of the first things we did when we wrote the new declaration is to look at what the if you rewrote the Limehouse Declaration, which kicked the party off in 81, what would it look like now? What would it if you rewrote it? There are three very important things that are the same, exactly the same. The first is a commitment to break the mold, to the idea that we're not well governed under the present political arrangements, and we need PR. And I'd leave it to the public to decide if we're well governed by the duopoly. Personally, I don't think we are. So a fundamental change to the political system is the primary thing. Still there, exactly the same agenda. Well, not reform of the House of Lords, removal of the House of Lords as an entity. So that reforming agenda to change British politics is still the same. The second main thing that's the same is the commitment to the social market economy, which is, it always requires explanation, this, but basically it's the belief that the market and the state are not opponents. They're complementary sides of the same society, and all successful societies understand that. The problem is that it's actually quite a revolutionary idea in British politics, because British politics is vested interest based. That's the third thing. We are contra vested interests. Again, it may seem almost utopian, but both major political parties represent blocs and always have done. And they seem capable of understanding that you should govern for the whole of society and not just parts. I think there are two main differences, and it's good that you've asked us about this. The first is the obvious one, which is growing Euroscepticism. There was a slight difference in the 80s between the very strong federalism of people like Roy Jenkins and Shirley Williams and David Owen, David Owen was much more of a nation state Democrat. And our strand of social democracy is very Owenite. And it's interesting that in the 80s, and a lot of people don't realize this because people say, well, how come the SDP is Eurosceptic, strongly Eurosceptic? Well, it has been since the 80s, actually, or the Owenite SDP has, because a year after the merger, 89, the SDP conference in Scarborough ruled out Eurofederalism. So you could already see the strains, you could already see the slight different approach all the way back. So I think we've probably mirrored David Owen's personal path in that he was responsible for that change in 89. And then he promoted the New Europe idea, which was basically a sort of looser federation of nation states, and then became a full Eurosceptic, as you know, in campaigning to leave in 2016. So that's a very important development, I'd say, on 1980s SDP iteration. The second important one is from the start, actually, Bruce, there was always a tension, and I saw it at grassroots level in campaign. There's always a tension in putting social democrats from the Labour Party with the Liberals. We always thought the Liberals were a little bit unworldly, a little bit sort of sandal wearing. You could always smell the joss sticks of Lib Demery in there. There was always a tension because the Social Democrats were used to government, used to high office, and wanted to govern. When we weren't really sure whether the Liberals really wanted that, or whether it was really a sort of species of protest politics. And so the second thing, I think, that sense of sort of antagonism with liberalism has increased, no doubt about it. And I think the way the world has turned in the 30 years, 40 years since has reinforced that. So I think the present iteration of the party I would describe as strongly post-liberal. I mean that in the political philosophy sense.
Yeah, well, let's explore this, because liberalism is a highly contested term, and your competitor parties are talking, using that word a lot in very different ways. So on your website, you talk about neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is the thing that the party is opposed to. So can we distinguish what you mean by neoliberalism, particularly differentiate it from, I think you're trying to differentiate it, but correct me if I'm wrong, I think you're trying to differentiate neoliberalism from classical liberalism. And then we have to differentiate this loose term liberalism from progressive, because progressives have adopted liberal, and classical liberals don't like the way progressives have adopted the term liberal. So can we pin down neoliberalism as you oppose it?
Yeah, I mean, you're quite right to say the terms. I mean, one of the major problems is that the way the terms are used in the UK and the US is different. And we get so much cultural politics from the US that it's actually a minefield. What I mean by liberalism, what I'm talking about, I would characterize it as the roughly 30 years of the combination of social liberalism and economic liberalism at the same time. So what you might call double liberalism. And I think it very much takes up the baton, basically, of New Labour being Thatcherite in economics broadly. I mean, again, you can argue about it, but as a social democrat, I would look at New Labour as being a colossal disappointment in failing to convene the support and commitment, actually, to do some very basic social democracy. I'm talking about nationalising railways, an industrial policy, build some council houses. They did nothing like that. Their modus operandi was market liberal in the sense that the city was given pretty much free rein, and the modus was make the city make money, we'll tax it and do a little bit of redistribution. Well, I think that was insufficient, and I think Blair was very, very much Thatcher's child in that respect. So again, it is very difficult to because everyone has their own view of it. So try and distinguish that between classical liberalism. Classical liberalism, I think, in the sort of free trade or Gladstonian sense, or the J.S. Mill sense of freedom of liberty being the first order thing. I'd have a lot of sympathy with that, and I think that's slightly different to what we're looking at. I think the main problem, if you want to sort of try and nail it, the main problem for liberalism, and I'm following writers like Chris Lash and John Gray here particularly, is that it's sort of morphed into a species of indifference. So what we have is first order. I want, for me, I can establish my rights, and I want to pursue those rights, and I want to sort of self-actualize. What's happened in the West is that that approach to self-actualization has allowed people to just decouple from the us, from what we are as a community. So you'll be aware, Bruce, that our strapline is family, community, nation. That's deliberate because I think in the West we've got the I-we balance wrong, and it needs rebalancing. And I would say on liberalism, it's simple, basic human overreach. So we need to correct those things, and that's what the project is partly about.
All right. So thank you, William. Now, the last part of that answer intrigued me because I think we're getting to a tension between classical liberalism and communitarianism, which I think is what you're advocating for as a differentiation with this party. So there is generally a tension between liberalism and the socialization of services, or the collectivization, as some people call it, in progressivism. So progressives talk about themselves as liberals, but they can appear authoritarian in the way they implement the collective benefits that they aim for. So equality of opportunity can often be manifested in policy as an intent to create equality of outcomes, and that is then seen as authoritarian rather than liberal. So the Social Democratic Party seems to be dancing on this tension. It wants to preserve some individual liberties, but it also wants to be communitarian. So is that a tension that you are mindful of? And given the public's concern about the sort of conflict between authoritarianism and individual liberty, particularly on issues such as free speech, how would you reassure the electorate that you, the SDP, have this balance right, where other parties like Starmer's Labour Party have it wrong?
That's a very good question, and there's a lot in there. I think this tension between individual freedom and the group obviously goes all the way back. I mean, in a sense, there's nothing new in politics in that. And you read, the writers in the 1700s, Rousseau, and you see it in John Locke. You see this constant tension between freedom and security. And in politics, I think political leaders, again, back to kings and princes, I think it's always a balance between those two things. And to go back to it, my answer about neoliberalism, I just think there has been an overreach. There's been a preoccupation with individual liberty and freedom. And in particular, just putting yourself first, the expectation that you always put yourself first and you drive your individual rights first, and the community is a little bit secondary. And I think that's very corrosive. It has a very long tail. In the Anglosphere, it probably goes back to writers in the 60s and John Rawls, and putting individual liberty first all the time, rights-based agenda. And in plain political language, I think most people understand that yes, you have rights, and individual liberty is very important, but you also have responsibilities. And I think most people instinctively understand that we've forgotten about responsibilities. And I think I say we, I think the political class has, but I think the public hasn't. I think politicians rarely have the guts to confront this and say, actually, what have you done? I mean, to go back to Kennedy's speech, when he was elected president, what can you do for your country? It's always about me. So I think that's where I see the tension. I think there is an appetite for a political party that understands that and wants to correct it. And I mean, there is so much. I mean, look at Starmer is, I would say, a progressive urban liberal. And you see this in politics very recently in the 2019 general election, this tension between a party that's like that, broadly like that, progressive, modern, liberal, urban, and a voting hinterland, which still understands, particularly in the sort of traditional Labour areas, that still understands that community is important and we're in it together. And Matt Goodwin talks about this in his writing a lot, about the way that those particular voters are a red and blue mix, as we say now. They're cross-pressured. You know, they're patriotic in the old sense. They understand that. They also, you know, many of them voted to leave the EU, and when they're respected, when, you know, progressive liberals weren't really bothered about that. But they also want good public services. You know, they'd actually depend on the NHS, and they actually depend and need housing. So that's the cross pressure. It's between, I think, between you know, rampant liberalism, which is the seedbed of it is the universities, as you know, and there's a sort of conveyor belt which has left sort of traditional conservative thinking in a difficult place. And I think, again, it depends. I think so much of politics is downstream from culture. I think, you know, slightly pessimistic writers like Gray and Ed West more recently would say, you know, actually the problem with conservatism in the West now is that we've lost all the arguments because no one's really made them, or certainly hasn't made them with any force. So that's where I'd see it. The I-we balance is the key thing. I think that's the thing that needs to be corrected.
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, I'm going to praise you. I mean, you started by saying very few politicians get into this, and I'm going to praise you. You do. So good for you for getting into the philosophy and the policy. This is a balance or a trade-off. It's really a trade-off between individual rights and collective responsibilities that politicians like to ignore, because it inevitably involves trade-offs, and they don't want to admit trade-offs in policy. So I commend you for that, but I'm going to press you to differentiate from Starmer's progressivism. So you've identified him as a progressive. I agree with you, but the way you describe the STP still has overlap with his form of progressivism. So, for instance, he claims to be strong on public services. You're claiming to be strong on public services. I think you're trying to differentiate New Labour as less patriotic and less,
certainly,
yeah. So less interested in national sovereignty. It's more interested in supranationalism. I accept that differentiation, but on public services, which are a real battleground for all the parties. So the Conservative Party claims to be strong on public services under its last three prime ministers, including the present one. So all the parties are competing on public services. They're all effectively claiming to be progressive. They're going to defend public services. So how are you going to differentiate the SDP on public services?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, I mean, it has become an arms race. And if you, I mean, on things like the NHS, for instance, it's become, you know, because it has a sort of quasi-religious quality to it. You know, you won't find any major politician that can criticize it well. I mean, I just have to say on that one, I just have a very realistic approach, and I've said so. I think the NHS, in reality, again, you won't get many politicians saying this, but what is the NHS is a very the good aspects of it are the universality. It achieves that, but in reality, if you look internationally, it's a very good second-rate system for a third-rate price. And I'm not saying you would get much more productivity out of it if you increase the price substantially. I think that's probably where I'd sit. I think you're going to have to spend more because of the demographics. But honestly, you know, if you look at it, 10% of GDP, the Americans spend about twice as much. They have no universality. I think the universality is the key thing about it. If anything, my approach to the NHS would be to make it a little bit more basic, a little bit more Cuban even, where if you're seriously ill, you get treated promptly and very well. But there is certainly reform that could take place. You know, there are examples of things that we do under the NHS we probably shouldn't. So I think more broadly, I think I like to use housing as a gap, a very interesting one, because I think the SDP is the only program which gets it right on housing. So let's just unpick that a little bit. So I think at the last election, Corbyn was quite right to propose a mass council house building program, and that's what we do. His was rather larger than ours, but nevertheless, it's the right approach. So he gets a tick for that. But where he gets marked down is his indifferent attitude towards mass immigration. So one, his plus VE on housing will be literally undermined if you have gross immigration, and that's that we know of, because there's a lot of immigration that we don't, of 750,000 a year, which is historically very, very high. And this all started under New Labour. So whatever he wants to do in housing will be undermined by his foolish attitudes towards mass immigration. And the Conservatives, likewise, if you look at them, they won't build any housing. Complete indifference. They're representing homeowners and they're quite keen on house price inflation, but that's very damaging to family formation. It's a reasonable expectation that young people should meet, possibly get a flat, possibly get a house, possibly raise a family. Now that normal process, which I would defend as a completely socially conservative one, and we're quite natalist, I suppose, there's a very strong paternalistic streak in our ideas. The Conservatives are completely indifferent to that, and that's liberalism or econ liberalism at its very worst, because they have no solutions. I'm actually bored each time I read a new SW1 think tank or right-leaning think tank piece on housing, which usually criticizes the planning system or has some ideas about brownfield. Not all nonsense. I mean, actually, largely, the Tories can't have an effective policy on housing unless they do something about the supply side. And actually, their record in immigration isn't very good. So actually, the winning numbers, if you're a serious politician, you have to confront it. You need much lower levels of immigration, and you need to roll your sleeves up and build some council houses. And this combination, a lot of our thinking is red and blue. And a lot of people are aware of Philip Blond and Maurice Glassman, in their projects, Red Tory and Blue Labour, and the differences between us and them. But there are a lot of similarities, and you'll see this a lot in our approach to things. The winning numbers on public policy in many areas are a combination of what people would think as right and left. And I'll just lob this in. During the sort of what we should do post-Brexit debate, a lot of econ, a lot of free trade purists, my friend Douglas Carswell and Danny Han and a lot of other people would argue, they'd mention Singapore and they say, oh, we're going to be Singapore. And I have to say, very few of the people that are saying that know anything about Singapore at all. I mean, Singapore is basically a sort of ultra version of what we're proposing, very, very communitarian, very high state involvement. I think 85% of Singaporeans live in public sector housing. Massive intervention in transport infrastructure and other things, highly, very regulated, but the pockets of free trade are defended as well. So they've got the combination right, and I think so. Anyway, I sort of chuckle when people mention Singapore on Thames. They know nothing about it, literally nothing.
Yeah. So thank you. You're really helping to unpack this differentiation. I suppose we're focused on differentiating from New Labour at the moment, and then we'll get on to the Lib Dems. So I think what we need to get to next is what your party describes as economically left-leaning. So there's implications in what you've said already about the left-leaning implications for the economy from your communitarian stance and your overlapping progressive stance on public services. So that's economically left-leaning, at least on the fiscal side. Can you unpack what you mean as a party by economically left-leaning in those fiscal terms? That means taxation, spending, property rights, public ownership, the extent to which the public sector plays a role in the economy, those sorts of things.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the key question for us is it's based on the social market idea, which is what is the correct frontier? I mean, in a sense, this is what all politics tries to work out. But what is the correct frontier between the state and the market? Where should that lie? And I've talked a lot about overreach. So yeah, railway privatization. That's liberal overreach, and it hasn't worked. It's crazy. I mean, it's just this terrible system. So we would see a publicly owned and run national railway system fully integrated as a basic domain issue for where the public sector should be. We would say housing, ditto. So those are good examples of where. I would also argue utilities. I think utilities are another thing that we don't have as a manifesto pledge, because we are fiscally sensible and we're not into MMT. I mean, I think a lot of that is actually crazy and very dangerous. But I think we seem to be heading there throughout the West, actually, money printing. But so where is the line? And I would only make a claim for the public sector to be where it should be. Now, the other side of the fence is how pro-market we are. And I would argue we're more pro-market than anyone in its correct domain. So what we've seen over the last sort of 30, 40 years in this neoliberal world is a retreat from state intervention to correct market failures and also to regulate the market properly. If you leave the market totally to itself, what you tend towards in the end is monopoly. And we've seen this. We've seen in virtually every single realm. You've seen fewer but larger and more powerful players. We've now got a situation of overreach where big tech massively overreaching into private spheres. Government's been inept, hasn't regulated it properly. But in the commercial world, the lockdown has reinforced this with Amazon basically assuming a position which is far too powerful, and I would doubt whether in many markets, book sales, CD sales of virtually anything you want to buy on Amazon, whether the small producer really has a chance. So I would say that the market, successive governments have failed to regulate the market properly, have allowed anything goes, and the public and the nation state has suffered as a result. Chris Lash is brilliant on how various elites have shared their responsibility to the nation. You're aware of David Goodhart's Anywhere Somewheres thing. Actually, that was, David, he's a friend of the party as well, and he acknowledges that actually, he wasn't the first. That book sort of brought those terms into the lexicon, but it's in Scruton's England book. Some people were connected to place, and place is a very important thing. But in the market sphere, what's happened is that we've allowed basically executives, super paid executives of large corporations, to put themselves first in the West, particularly, and society and the country comes second, and that's a very anywhere attitude, and it's something I think where there is a sort of, it's something that Peter Shaw used to talk about a lot. That the corporation's interest isn't always the national interest, and I think if you look at some of the successful states in Southeast Asia, South Korea, Japan, and so on, Singapore, they wouldn't dream of doing that. They wouldn't dream of doing that. There is a sense where they have a duty to the nation that they're part of. And I think a lot of corporate elites have completely forgotten that. And you saw it in the Brexit debate where they've forgotten it, but they also have their status as anywhere as a sort of unhooked them or uncoupled them with their obligations to their fellow citizens. Instead of having an obligation to their fellow citizens, they mock them. So that's where we are. I just want to finish on this section by saying there's a lovely line. Robert Skidelsky wrote a pamphlet for the SDP called The Social Market in '88 under Owen's iteration. And there's a beautiful line in that where he talks about basically the market needing regulation. And it's either regulated properly by ultimately it's either regulated properly by those that are friendly to it, like us, or eventually it's destroyed by its enemies. I mean, don't forget. I mean, you know, if you push the inequality so far and the society ceases to work, it threatens the whole system, and that's a point we would say.
Yeah. So thank you, William. That's very clear. I suppose the part we need to explore is, you mentioned the corporations. So I think your balance is clear between public ownership and government intervention to break up monopolies. So in a sense, that's conservative, because at least American conservatives are very strong on breaking up the big tech monopolies that you're talking about. And
yes,
monopolies are, yeah, we don't protecting the market from monopolies is it's a classically liberal agenda. So I think that speaks to your philosophical balances, or trade-offs balances, if I can call them that. Now, when you first mentioned the social market economy, the first thing I thought about was the German model, as it used to be called, even in the 1980s. And I think I'm correct in saying that the old SDP used to look to the German model and as an alternative to Thatcherism. And what it meant was that corporations, businesses in general, could be run as a partnership between management and the workers.
yeah.
Is that something that is in the new SDP's thinking?
It's very interesting. The genesis of the term, the social market term, was introduced in British politics by the SDP, and was pretty much promoted throughout the whole of its time. It is a difficult thing to properly pin down. It actually has origins in the post-war order liberalism, which is actually quite right-wing. Actually, it's a strange thing. The post-war German order liberals were very, very liberal in their pro-market economics. I think it morphed. Actually, David Owen, to be fair to him, slightly changed its definition, and it was one of the jokes, the in-jokes in the party rank and file, that we thought the social market was a great idea. If we understood it, we could sell it. But where does it lie now? I think it's morphed really from I think the industrial democracy thing is important, but I think there's a demand side issue with that. Morris Glassman and Blue Labour talks about this a lot, and they think that if only people were given the chance to get onto workers' boards and management committees and so on, they would jump at it. And I think it was Crossman who said, actually, no, people want to be doing their gardens at the weekend, really. They don't really want to be doing this. So I think the main problem, it's a little bit, the industrial democracy side, I think, is a little bit ambitious. So I would describe our version of the social market as primarily a defense of, I'll go back to it, the frontiers or the boundaries between what the state should do and what the market should do, and how the market is regulated. That's the key thing.
Yeah. Okay, I got it. Right. So, I mean, you're balancing free market, essentially, you want the free market to do everything that is not better done by the public sector.
Yeah.
Like railways.
It does it better, Bruce. I mean, there's no question. I mean, the normal production of goods and services is most productively done for most things by the market, by incentives and efficiencies that the market has. My only claim for the state is to do what it naturally should do. And I think the past 30 or 40 years are good examples of where, if the state fails to do those very basic things, we're all worse off. Yeah.
So let's pin down the things that you believe should be in public ownership. So you mentioned railways, housing. I think you imply the majority of housing should be publicly owned. Is that fair?
No, not at all. No, it's a modest. I mean, I think it's a very reasonable and modest program that we're offering. What's happened is that we've drifted. I did an interview during the election in 2019. They said, well, left-leaning. How left-leaning? And actually, well, it's a fact that if the SDP's program in that election, 2019, was implemented, you'd be electing the most left-wing, economically left-wing government since '74. But the point I'd make about that is that that's not saying very much, because the center of gravity has shifted so much that even the basic things that the state could and should do has been changed by the chain, by Hayek's thought and the Thatcherite agenda that came to power in '79, or you could say maybe came to power under Callaghan in '76 after the IMF, but whatever. But the point is that it's a modest claim. It's actually a modest claim. It's like in trade policy and industrial policy. We don't really have an industrial policy, but I would argue that all successful states do. I mean, it's not to ask a hell of a lot. It's just to consider that every single time a UK major producer, whether it's Jaguar or whether it's losing your nuclear industry and farming it out to the French and the Chinese, it's a matter of not being indifferent to that. It's a matter of saying we used to have it, and why lose it through indifference from a national point of view. It's very interesting that a lot of the debates that we've had in the pandemic has rawly exposed the gutting, the indifferent attitudes towards these things. Gutting your industry has consequences, and it actually has strategic consequences. One of the funniest things, very, very recently, has been to read accounts of Ian Duncan Smith and John Redwood defending, in the trade talks, the importance of state aid. Of course. I mean, you have to get to the stage where you're on your knees. Do you have to get to the stage where you're on your knees and you can't get basic supplies before you realize that some things are strategic and some things are of national importance? So, there are lots of interweaving themes here, but I think it's a basic correction to that.
Yeah. So what you're saying is clear. So let me just try to pin down you on how you might quantify or proportionate, if I just coined you.
I can help you. I can help you on housing, for instance.
On housing, yeah. I mean, to what extent? What's the limit of public housing as a proportion of all housing, say, or what? Who is entitled to public housing? Can we define that?
Well, I don't think there is. I mean, we wouldn't go about saying, well, X number, 30-40% of people have to. I'll give you some figures. So when Mrs. Thatcher was elected in '79, 42% of the British public lived in council houses. The figure is about 8% now. There's a slightly higher number than that live in social housing of various kinds by social housing providers. But basically, over the last 30, 40 years, the public sector's role or participation has been vastly denuded. As to what size it should be, I can't give you a figure. What I can say is that if it took 30 or 40 years to smash the sector, I think it'll take sort of 10, 20 years to regrow it. We did some work with our economists on what we would do, and our proposals on state sector housing very modest, actually. And if you work it out, 6 or 7 billion a year, which by current standards, considering we're spending about $1 trillion on COVID, is a drop in the ocean. If you consistently spend that, you could house 1 million people in 10 years. It wouldn't be done quickly, but the state should certainly do it. And actually, the scale of it, if you break it down to sort of individual local authorities, because it's local authorities that should regain the capacity and the will actually to do some of this stuff. It's about 180 units per London borough per year. That's all. I mean, it's not actually, what we're asking for is not actually very large, and you wouldn't get up to Singaporean levels. By and large, most people still in the UK have an aim to own their houses if they can, but you're just reinstating a part of the housing market that has been deliberately removed and has caused a lot of problems. And as I say, I don't know how any sort of modern conservative in the Conservative Party can argue that they're pro-family if they're so indifferent to the housing sector. It doesn't make any sense at all.
Well, so let me try a final frame for asking the question. So it sounds to me, right, and I'm not going to put words into your mouth, but so you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds to me if you can't define the level of public housing by a proportion of all housing, then you've got to define it by entitlements, as in some people are entitled to public housing, and then the proportion of housing will shake out as a result of that. So is that correct? Will the SDP change who is entitled to public housing?
I think there should be more local control actually in that. I think there's a role for community councils in this as well. There's nothing stopping the community council that I chair in Northumberland is one of the few, I think it's the only one actually that's building any council houses at the moment. We're building 4, but again, the heavy lifting would be done by, in that case, 13,000 community houses, councils, and if they all built 4, it would actually start to make a difference. And I think I would expect, and we do intend, to be able to allocate that housing to people that live in our community and have some degree of, I mean, I'm not going back to the sort of parish list in the 1800s of the deserving, but I think there should be some more localism in that, and I think there should be some more local choice in that, and a little bit more discretion. We have a very highly centralized local government system, but you know, you'd be surprised on the numbers if every community council and every local authority got back into the business of this. The problem, Bruce, is that if you look at the post-war, people look at the Attlee government, which is a government that was in, you know, deep austerity, genuine austerity, rationing, food rationing, but still managed, partly as a result of the solidarity that was convened during the war, but managed to build, you know, housing in the millions because there was a commitment to it. And I think a lot of what's happened is just this reluctance for the state, a lack of belief that the state can do anything. I mean, I think that is, again, a thing I'm very, very critical of people in the Conservative Party about, because you know, if you go into government or governance like that, and you literally say, well, I think we'll have the smallest state we can. I'm not really sure that we can do anything about these things. Well, that's just not a very interesting or helpful prospectus.
Yeah, well, that's I sort of agree with you, but at the same time, it's not helpful to go the other way and say, you know, we should be more ambitious in what we can afford, because that's a slippery slope too. You know, the Labour Party is still struggling with its legacy of tax and spend, and being seen as a party that, once it's in government, will inevitably keep taxing and spending. It doesn't know its limits. So you know, the SDP, if the SDP is going to say to the electorate, we can afford more public spending than the Conservatives let on, you're going to get part of the electorate saying, well, hang on, you sound like old Labour, and we can't trust old Labour.
I'll try and help you there. No, we're quite fiscally conservative in the sense that we've never argued you could or should have social democracy splurging money around and building up debts to your children and grandchildren. We're totally against that. And you know, it may have been a mistake actually, and largely because of COVID. Now it's irrelevant. There is a published aim that we think, you know, government spending as a percentage of GDP is about 42%, about right. I think that's probably true. I mean, you look at the French state, which is in deep trouble, hasn't had a budget surplus since 71 or 2, I think, under Pompidou. That's just out of control. And what that approach doesn't grasp is that there's very strong diminishing returns very, very quickly. So we've never argued for that. I think we try and be honest with the public and say a lot of these things can't be solved overnight. And a lot of our thinking is 10 years, 15 years thinking. You know, if you chip away at some of these things, consistently go at them, then you get there. But I'm sorry to say that you couldn't say to the millennials in London who are sadly were inclined to vote for Corbyn through desperation, And I would say, who can blame them? Because they're in a situation where they can't reasonably expect to build a family and a home in the southeast or in London. You know, I'm sorry, we can't solve that probably for your generation. Actually, I would say, if you're honest about it, you can't just click your fingers and create, you know, millions and millions of council houses and affect the price of housing. I mean, I think the price of housing clearly is too high, which is, you know, it's partly a function of wholesale, you know, money finding its way into that market and pumping it up. But you can't solve a lot of these things overnight. And I very much look at it in terms of a 30-year overreach and probably a 30-year correction, something like that.
Yeah, and you've mentioned that you would correct the demand side through mass immigration. So the mass immigration part of the demand side you would correct, and possibly we should just clarify that part of your argument. Do you have a target level of immigration in the quantitative sense and the temporal sense? So the Conservative Party has long had a target level of immigration which it has never met. It takes credit for a decline in immigration, which it cannot really take credit for. It has more to do with Brexit and wider international market forces. Does the SDP have a target level of immigration, and by what time period would it promise to fulfill that target?
Well, the published target in the policy set is 100,000 net. But remember, that's net. So gross could still would probably be something like 300,000 or 400,000, and it would net out at 100,000. I think that's about right. And actually on the data, that's the level that the public are reasonably comfortable with. In terms of timescales, again, I got myself into a little bit of trouble for arguing recently or last year that we need a mass immigration pause, quite a long one. And I think a lot of countries in the West should look at this, be very wise to look at it. It was misinterpreted as that I was calling for sort of zero immigration. I mean, no one's arguing for that. But certainly a mass immigration pause is a sensible option. I'm talking about a long pause, you know, it could be 15, 20 years, possibly more. And people need to be aware that there are precedents for this. You know, the United States famously had a mass immigration pause from 1920 till about 1970. Obviously, there were problems in the 30s, and then you've got the war. But the post-war period, you had you know, strong productivity gains, population growth based on domestic growth rather than imported. And you know, a lot of people say it was a highly successful period in the United States' history. So the idea that again, it's probably a recurring theme, but I'm going to criticize, you know, some species of liberal thought or neoliberal thought in immigration, because what they say, they assume, let's just do a trade-off here. So let's say if we keep our mass immigration at sort of 750,000 a year, and the argument that's put is that you need that level of immigration. A lot of it's students coming, you know, and it just very, very open doors approach to all this stuff. If you reduce that, it'll harm GDP growth. Yeah, that's the argument that's always made, and it betrays a sort of liberal indifference to who is doing what where. So you know, to the sort of, you know, econ liberal purists, it doesn't matter where you get your labour from, and that was always our argument in the EU. You know, you've got a massive labour market of 600 million or whatever. And it really doesn't matter. Let's not bother training anyone domestically. Let's just buy it in. Doesn't matter. People are econs, just pop them in. Doesn't matter who they are. And I think that's a mistake, because if you go to the public in a serious way and you say, look, would you like mass immigration and 2.5% GDP growth? Or would you like controlled, sensible immigration and have 2.25%, but greater social harmony? My bet is that the public go for the slightly lower, probably more sustainable level of growth and a greater degree of social harmony. But it's because the politicians usually don't have the vocabulary or the desire to confront this, the question's never asked. That's the bizarre thing. I mean, it's never asked. I mean, it's the same in the Brexit debate. One of the reasons Remain lost was that they thought the econ side was the first order thing. They thought that it was all about, oh, you'd be worse off. A lot of people in Sunderland thought, well, bring it on. But I wouldn't mind my democracy, and I wouldn't mind a bit of nation-state solidarity. So I think politics hasn't been very good at getting underneath some of the issues and some of the nuances, but certainly on immigration, we'd be arguing for far lower and far lower, far longer.
Yeah, well, I think everybody agrees that the public wants lower immigration, so that's been true for decades. But one of the explanations for why governments repeatedly fail to lower immigration is that they are less motivated by the general electorate than they are about the interest group, which is mostly the low-paid service sector, which doesn't really need immigrants, but it claims it needs immigrants. What it really means is that they're cheap.
Yes.
And there are some high-skilled sectors that benefit productively wise in having foreigners come in with particular skills, but that's a tiny part of the overall immigration. It's low skilled and it's low qualified people who benefit the service sector and make very high demands on the public sector and drive up housing prices and all these other things. So I think you're correct to pursue the votes in wanting to lower immigration, but at the same time, you've got the problem we discussed earlier, which is all parties claim that they're going to lower immigration, or they're going to have they'll use euphemisms like we'll have a sensible or a balanced immigration policy, and then they never actually lower immigration, or they take credit. Like the Johnson administration, Boris Johnson is taking credit for a decline in net immigration that is due to international market forces or events, not due to policy. So I think, if I may be so bold, I think the SDP still has a problem in arguing that it has the solution. I think more precisely, you're going to have a problem differentiating from the other parties your policy of lowering immigration, given the electorate's skepticism that any party ever delivers on that promise. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, no, I take the point, but in terms of consistency, I mean, if Boris Johnson had ever genuinely believed or argued for lower immigration, then I'm sorry I've missed it. I think I think he's argued. I think he's a liberal in both senses of the word. I don't think he's much of a conservative of any kind. So he'd be being consistent if he sort of just does a little bit of rhetoric and continues doing what the Tories do on this, which is basically the immigration levels were ratcheted up under New Labour, Andrew Nether's famous quote and all the rest of it. So it was partly for political reasons, to change the structure of the society. And the Conservatives have been in power of some sort of coalition, otherwise, for a long time now, have done nothing about it. So it's been a ratchet, and they've failed to. But I mean, what people can't say is that the Social Democrats haven't argued strongly for low immigration. Patrick O'Flynn, myself, and Rod Liddle have all argued for it. And what I would say is that the premises for the argument are strongly centre-left aims, particularly on training. I mean, people don't realise that if you rely on very, very high levels of particularly unskilled labour, it just disincentivizes. And there's no incentive economically for you to train any of your the people say, if you can get Svetlana, then you don't train Sharon, and that's largely what's happened. That's basically what's happened, and it shows an indifference to your own fellow citizens, which and it won't be corrected until, you won't get anyone training the right number of nurses, the right number of, particularly in the technical trades, actually. That's David Goodhart's new book Head, Hand, Heart is all about that. The lack of balance. We're funneling, higher education, university education is vastly overexpanded, vastly, and it's not socially useful. It really isn't. I mean, to all you're storing up there, Michael Lynn's wrote on this in the States very well. All you're doing there is storing up discontentment, which in the end will be political discontentment. You'll end up with, Portland is where you end up there. And so you need a correction to that. You need to do more skills and vocational training, basic stuff, and, slim down the university sector. We'll all be better off. So, but, all of these things are interrelated. You can't have, you won't get training until there's an incentive. The other side is just a very, very basic centre-left point. John Gray's made it. Paul Embry makes it all the time. He's correct that if the supply of something increases, the cost of it goes down. And I think you can't argue that our involvement in the single market for freedom of movement of labour hasn't had, in some sectors, some parts of it, downward pressure on real wages. And the Labour Party used to understand that, but it's completely washed its hands of what used to be its core supporters, manual workers, low skilled workers. Yeah,
well, that's an appropriate place to end a discussion on what I think is the differentiation between SDP and New Labour. So we've spent a lot of time differentiating SDP from New Labour because I think the electorate will naturally consider you the closest, your closest competitor ideologically. They will assume as a starting point is New Labour before they get into the cultural parts of your manifesto, which I'm very keen to talk about. I think that the cultural part will then bring you into competition with the Conservative Party, which claims to be the patriotic party and the nativist party and those other things which you are talking about. Before I get to the Conservatives, if I may, I think we should briefly differentiate you from the Lib Dems, because the Lib Dems and the SDP have this very close evolutionary history, as you've described it yourself. The Lib Dems are the third party, although the SNP has competed with that. I don't think you're competing with the SNP, so let's focus on the Lib Dems. So how do you differentiate SDP from Lib Dems?
I'm going to be cruel here, and it sort of presupposes that there's a coherent political philosophy in the Lib Dem side, not our side. So, I'm not joking. What I had a letter published in the Spectator at Christmas about this. The Lib Dems are in real trouble, and I think its cause actually, funnily enough, goes back to the merger. You might say I would say that, but it really does. What's happened now is they're trying to blend three very distinct components in a quite a small party with now a very small vote. So you've got the three elements in the Liberal Party. You've got proper Gladstonian free trade liberals, Orange Book liberals. They know what they're about. It's a respectable political tradition, and that's classical liberalism, I guess. But I'd argue those people would be more at home in the Tory Party. Frankly, they'd find more compatriots. They'd find more friends. The Tory Party has quite a few of those. And then you've got sort of Layla Moran type woke progressives. And frankly, I can't find any difference between them and a lot of what the Labour Party is now. And so, frankly, they'd be happier and more at home there. And then you have some Social Democrats from all the way back who, frankly, should come back to us. I mean, there is a problem if they're strongly Europhile, but as a political philosophy, it's quite distinct. Now, I mean, frankly, there isn't a synthesis. There isn't a coherent synthesis between those three things. And what they're trying to do, they don't know what they're about. I mean, I don't know what they're about. So in trying to answer the question of how we differentiate with them, I mean, I sort of hesitate to say. I don't know. I mean, I'd certainly say is they are now they would be, the Lib Dems as a party would be our political opponents flat. I mean, I think they'd probably, in a coalition race, they'd be pretty much my least desired coalition partner. And so, yes, I know we do have an issue of messaging. We do have a question of association and so on. But, you know, I think that's where it is. So, you know, just leaving to it, I said when we started the resurgence, you know, a couple of years ago, what people asked me what my aim was. And I said, well, give us 10 years just to replace the Lib Dems as a serious option. But it, you know, I don't like centrism actually very much. You might find it odd for me to say that. It's a vague term. You know, Macron's a centrist, I suppose, Blair. I mean, I just don't really like the term at all. What I like to emphasize in the SDP's way of thinking is the red-blue combination. And I've argued throughout that the red bits are pretty red and the blue bits are very blue. But it's in the colors, you know, so that's a clue.
Yeah, thank you. That's very clear, thank you. So let's get on to the blue bits then. So let's talk about your promise as a party to be patriotic,
yeah,
sovereign, and the phrase you use on culture is culturally traditional. So this is the part that's going to appeal to disaffected Tories. There are a lot of new parties actually competing for the disaffected Tories, including Reclaim, Reform UK. So what, how would you specify the SDP's patriotism? What do you mean by patriotism? And what do you mean by cultural traditionalism? And in that, well, let's start with the patriotism, but just to forewarn you about the cultural traditionalism that I'm interested there, you've picked a particular turn of phrase. You're not talking about culturally conservative or socially conservative, which the parties that are competing for the disaffected Tories are using, Reclaim, Reform UK. So I'm going to forewarn you, I'm very interested in why you focus on traditionalism and you're avoiding the word conservative when you are going after disaffected Tories. But let's start with patriotism and then we'll get to the cultural part. What do you mean by the SDP being patriotic?
Oh, well, that is just love of your country and love of your society and its traditions, its literature, its history, you know, its religious traditions, its architecture, a sense of place, and being comfortable with your fellow citizens and their culture. I don't think you can have that attitude and love your country and be indifferent to it changing or morphing into something completely different, or the sense of loss that you must feel if it changes beyond recognition. That's just a fundamental thing. I love the Scruton quote, you know, that any conservative at home with themselves, you know, it's love of what you have and a desire to hold on to, Scruton says, hold on to what you love. That's a natural thing. So that's the sort of basic. It's not new and it's not distinctive necessarily to us, but it's patriotic in that sense.
You did, sorry William, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I suppose I have. You just referenced Scruton and you use the semantic frame conserve there in an affectionate way, so you seem to
well, I was gonna because in your introduction there you said that we don't describe ourselves as social conservatives. We do, and I have done a lot. So I think that's just possibly, you know, what you might have read recently or done. No, I mean, I'm perfectly comfortable with it. I've argued and said publicly in interviews and written that we are more socially conservative than the Conservatives. But that's not very difficult, as everyone knows.
Right.
So,
okay.
You know, I interviewed Peter Hitchens a few months ago, and he was quite surprised that we had a lot of common ground, actually, and a lot of common ground on some of the left econ stuff as well, which is very interesting. But so, no, I mean, I think I really deeply admire Scruton in that sense, and Oakeshott, who again on his sort of Burkean quote, the very famous quote about, you know, being more comfortable with the familiar than the distant and the tried and tested. I think there's, you know, that's just something that's, I would argue, is part of us. And I also argue strongly that the social, the group, the communal element of social conservatism is key. And I think it's something that modern econ sort of Hayek liberals, you know, market liberal purists just don't understand. They don't. It's a tragedy. It's a tragedy of Thatcherism. You know, Perry Worsthorne's quote, you know, that she made the country more like her son than her father. That's the point. They don't seem to understand that, you know, ultra econ liberalism, free trade, you know, a lot of it is not actually very compatible with social conservatism. But why? Because it, as Scruton has said, it breaks down the foundations. So I think what's happened is you've got economic liberalism doing this to the society, open immigration, trade that wrecks and guts factories and destroys communities. And then you've got the social liberalism, which I'd attack for its, I mean, I don't know whether it's first order or second order, but you know, certainly there's in the progressive project, which goes all the way back. I mean, I think certainly some of the people that have reacted to the extreme elements of progressivism that we get from the States don't seem to realize that it goes all the way back to Rousseau and probably further back, and it goes certainly in the late 1900s. Chesterton was writing about it. You've written about it. I read a piece that you wrote in the Critica on Evil and War. It's basically about the same subject. Orwell wrote about it. It goes all the way back. It's not new. Daniel Bell wrote about it. It has a very long tail effect, you know, and basically the progressive project is a project of deconstruction. At its woke, at its really extreme woke iteration now, it's highly destructive. It's highly destructive. The project is to deconstruct the foundations of where we are. So they want to deconstruct the nation state. They're very happy at religion being deconstructed. I mean, we are sort of pretty post-religious, but you know, personally, I'm a Christian, but I'm not a believer, if that makes any sense. You know, get rid of religion, get rid of the nation state. So get rid of any solidarity between citizens, break that down. You know, very antagonistic to the family, you know, the progressive project. So, you know, I think it's just basic. If you undermine the foundations, those foundations in that way, you're into just chaos. You know, you're into where we are. You know, and I suppose if this recording goes out today, you know, we've just had the events on Capitol Hill and the Senate and so on, and that's just the people that think that's about just what Trump has done don't realize the causal chain, which is that liberalism, you know, Trump's liberalism's baby, and squarely. So, yeah, I mean, so when we mean patriotic and culturally traditional, no, we're just, I would say, defending the basics.
Yeah, okay, it's very clear, William. I appreciate it. Thank you. So let's get on to how you would differentiate yourself further from the Conservative Party. You're stealing their patriots, and you're stealing their traditionalists, and you're stealing their social conservatives too, because you know, there's a website I also write for, Conservative Woman, which explicitly differentiates itself from the Conservative Party as the Conservative Woman website is socially conservative, the Conservative Party is not. So you would be stealing social conservatives. Who else can you steal? And by what policies can you steal them from the Conservative Party?
Well, there's a lot in there anyway. I mean, you know, that's any traditional conservative who is comfortable with the state doing the things that we want to do, which I'll say it again, we're not asking for very much here. It's not actually, those are just the fundamental things that you might want the state to do. If you combine that with the public sense, the hinterland sense of social conservatism, solidarity, and respect for the family. I mean, no, you know, look at the family. Let's talk about the family. Conservatives stopped talking and defending the family years ago. I mean, they just don't do it. And there's nothing, absolutely nothing in the program that is made from housing to fiscal support or recognition of marriage. Nothing. There's nothing in there. But again, I think it's not just I mean, people say, you know, we're very pro-family, but what would you do about it? I think the cultural discourse is the primary thing, because I think a lot of the other stuff's downstream. So, you know, in every single time knife crime is debated, which in London is every week virtually. So Sadiq Khan will say, I want more youth clubs and resources. Fine. Yeah. But if he thinks that is going to stop county lines, he has another thing coming. But the Conservatives won't make the basic case. So that you know, they won't say that you're dealing with symptoms here, and to ignore absent fatherhood, to ignore the long disintegration of the family, and to think that, you know, we think lads need dads. It's just fundamental, and no one else is saying that. So it's dreary. It's not actually very difficult to steal their clothes, because they're not their clothes. I mean, one of the things that this project is about, and I think, yes, we're a small party, but I think if you get the foundations right, you know, the sky's the limit. I think if people are unwilling to make the basic arguments which the public can understand clearly, like defending the family, then I'm sorry, they're not entitled to their votes. And you know, Conservatives, election after election, go into the election promising, sounding a little bit tougher on immigration, a little bit this and a little bit that, and they let the side down, always let the side down, which Con Woman and a lot of the other, you know, websites and forums are perfectly aware of. You have to mean it. You have to mean it. And I think Starmer, it's very interesting. Is it Kate Ainsley, his new advisor, you know, wants him to get patriotic, so he started to use Union Jacks. Yeah, this is the guy that for 3 or 4 years didn't even want the UK to be a nation state, wanted it to be a member state. So I think you just have to rely on a little bit of consistency, and the public have to really ask themselves, do these people mean it? And I just don't. I mean, the Conservative Party is a sort of, you know, to be honest with you, I mean, I was a member for 4 years in the brief interregnum between the end of the 80s and you know, when I got back into politics, and I just think it was just a pragmatic group, really. You have some free traders that believe in things, but believing in things is not their strong point.
No, right. Yeah, I've said it before. It's a progressive party more than a conservative party, although it does have some very conservative members, but as a party, its front bench is progressive.
Yes, and I think that's true. I think, you know, there's an analogy with Tony Benn's comment about the Labour Party. You know, he said it's not a socialist party, but it has socialists in it. That's true. I mean, they're very broad churches, and I think in arguing for PR and a reset, I mean, I think Peter Hitchens was right. I mean, you need a Conservative Party, don't you? I mean, there are Conservatives, and they have no one to vote for. But I'll give you an example, because I use the word indifference a lot in criticising modern Conservatives. The modern Conservatives approach, look at the obesity epidemic. If you go to certain wards, say in Gateshead or South Tyneside, you know, I live in the Northeast, and you look at the obesity rates of children starting primary school, in some districts, in some wards, 30%, yeah, 30%. You've got an obesity epidemic. You walk down the supermarket aisle and it's junk food everywhere. And the modern Conservative view is you don't do anything about it. You literally don't do anything about it at all. But that's basically indifference. You know, I'm not arguing for a sort of return to the Edwardian system, but a policy we advocate strongly is the Daily Mile policy, which is every kid desk to desk runs a mile every day. Now, all the metrics on all the schools that do it are brilliant. The boys concentrate better, and you know, and we just get good results, health results and education results, and every single school should do it. We also want to ban the sale of sugary sweets in school. Why not? Why not? Why not have a policy of every child in school having a decent meal, and get rid of the discretion to have a lunchbox, which is a Kit Kat and a bag of crisps? Now, you have to argue your case if you believe in this stuff, but I think the Conservatives just don't believe in it, and it's a tension that you would understand, you'd recognise between, you know, sort of libertarian type Conservatives. You can't tell us to do that, Well, I would argue Singaporeans, I mean, they're quite a different type of, a much more communitarian culture, but the idea that you can just fold your hands, sit on the sidelines and do absolutely nothing as if it doesn't matter is ridiculous. So in the SDP's approach to something like that, perfect example, you're getting our approach to rigor in schools. Look at what McKellar, look at what Catherine Birbal Singh has achieved by just putting in patriotism and rigor in schools. And a lot of these things are cultural. So defend those things and argue for them, but don't do nothing. And I really, if I dislike a streak in the modern Tory party, it's the streak of indifference. It doesn't really bother us, really. Well, I think it should. And I think, yes, at the risk of being called interfering or bossy or whatever, go for it.
Yeah, very clear. Thank you. So I think that segues into lockdown, because your party has an anti-lockdown position. Why do you have that position, and what's your alternative?
Yeah, good question. And it's actually a question which sort of goes into the philosophy a little bit, so I'll try and do that. We supported the first lockdown, but that was all. But even then, new disease, and it was meant to be temporary, and it was on the hook of trying to build capacity in the NHS. Seemed rational. Yeah, okay, support the first one. But even when the first one was happening, I wrote a piece which eventually I gave it to the Specky, and they didn't run it, and I can't remember, we gave it to someone else, and we published it on SDP Talk, and I called it The Tragic Necessity of the Lockdown. And even then, in March, I suspected that the aggregate human cost and the tail effect from the policy, the suppression policy, would certainly create more human misery than the plus side. And I still think that. I still think that, because for lots of reasons, not just because so many other categories of misery have been exacerbated or created. The usual things, suicide, loneliness, lack of treatment of cancer victims and other victims of other things, the massive fiscal effects and so on. This is theoretically wrecking the prospects of an entire generation, not to be taken lightly. The efficiency of lockdowns is another question. We didn't really know that anyway until later. Lots of Frontiers of Health report on the meta study could not find a strong link between suppression measures, including lockdowns and death rates. And I still think so even the plus side that they claim for lockdowns is not clear. But just to get onto the philosophy, a lot of people, certainly some other parties you might be aware of, have been skeptical on the libertarian and freedom side. And I think that's very important. I mean, I'm not saying it's not important, but for us, it was slightly second order. And it was slightly second order because curtailing freedom temporarily, or in a transitory sense, is different from a permanent curtailment of freedom. And I'm not saying that, and I think there are risks that the liberties that are removed by the state are not always, historically, re-given. I'm perfectly aware of that. So there are dangers there. But the SDP's argument was communitarian and libertarian, and utilitarian, not libertarian. And I still think the utilitarian case is very, very strong. There was some work done by an economist in the city called George Cooper, who just quantified on the available data the quality of effect adjusted life years, the QALYs, which NICE allocates health spending on. There is a rationing effect in any resource, and it's rational to do that. So National Institute for Clinical Excellence will ration a quality adjusted life year at about £15,000, upper limit about £30,000. If you go onto the National Audit Office and you crunch the numbers on the money spent on the suppression measures and then the consequent money with the furlough and the other schemes, you're already at 360 billion. It's not over yet. It'll get up to 500 billion. And then you look at the possible, if you're being very generous, if you look at the possible number of lives saved, you get to, and also if you factor in the age of the victims of this disease, you get to a cost of a quality adjusted life year of about £1 million, which implies an inflation rate of something like 6,700% in public spending. So this is unhinged. This is totally unhinged. So I think we're probably in the realms of a policy mega error, a synchronized policy mega error across lots of societies. When one society does it, the others do it. So you've got the synchronized effect. Social media hasn't helped because you've had a sort of moral panic thing going on as well. So largely, I think it's, I've given lots of interviews on this, I think it's where we are. I called it a tragic necessity because I think due to proximity, no modern politician really would be in a position to resist it. And I think that is a tragedy, but it's the way the press works, and it's the way the whole thing's reported, and so it's proved, as only Sweden had a different view. I mean, I chatting to Peter Hitchens about it, he said, well, Sweden did it differently. And I pointed out to Peter that Sweden did it differently because Tegnell and Giesecke advised the government to do it differently. So their policy was in line with their experts. And I said to Peter, if Nervtag and Sage were advising to lock down, sorry, every single government would have done it, but it is a tragedy.
Yeah, and also Sweden has very different geography and demographic distribution, so it has much lower population density and essentially only one city. So yes, it's easier to social distance, and it has a more compliant society.
Yes.
More responsible, more mannered, and that sort of thing. That hasn't necessarily worked out any better for them, but
that's the point. I mean, that's when these things are judged, in a few years' time. I'm afraid to say the range and quality of public policy responses has not significantly affected the overall death rate, I'm afraid. I mean, it's, certainly some cases from South America, the harder the lockdowns, the more disease has spread and caused death. So I'm afraid, there's a lovely interview that Freddie Sayers did with Giesecke early on, and Giesecke said, look, it's going to roll over, I'm afraid. This is the reality of viral epidemics. And, it's a natural human instinct to not want to see that, or to say the government has to do this or that. And I'm not, I've never argued for no action. Obviously it's sensible to take precautions to shield the elderly and so on. But I think, again, a thing that we haven't achieved in the UK is that we've gone for comprehensive lockdown instead of and then in the tier system you've gone for geographical lockdown instead of a lockdown based on vulnerability.
Yes, and there's a lack of quarantining of the actual infected. I've written that lockdown is a national punishment for a prior policy failure, such as quarantining in hospital and locally locking down the hotspots, which was a policy the British government got to only at the end of the summer. So anytime you have a national lockdown, that is an admission of failure of prior policy, because it's your last resort.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. I mean, I think that's very fair, and I think you're right also to note the cultural differences in Sweden. Another thing that you didn't mention is that 40% of Swedes live alone. So there's lots of differences which explain Taiwan and South Korea, Singapore, Japan. I wouldn't trust any of the figures from China. I don't think trust them on figures, but I think certainly some other countries have done it differently. But it's not to say, I mean, I think it's not to be naive about it and say that you can transport some of their policies into a society which is very different. I mean, to go back to Singapore again, I mean, people argue for Singapore in terms, we'd first have to have the Singapore society to get the society. If you want to, you've got to, a lot of ideas and policies are not actually that transportable. You've got to be aware of what your society is.
But you just reminded me of Thatcher's comment on the German model. So when she got economists come into number 10 to urge her to consider the German model, her response was, well, maybe the German model works in Germany because they're German.
Yeah, no, very perceptive. I mean, that's basically, there's a lot in that. There's a huge, you can't untether public policy from the culture that you're in. You have to work with the grain on that.
Well, thank you, William. That was all very clear on lockdown. I'm just going to give you the opportunity to add anything that differentiates the SDP's position on lockdown from Reform UK and Reclaim, because both of those parties are also anti-lockdown. As you know, I've interviewed both of the parties, and I think it's fair to say that Reform UK's position is probably more libertarian or classically liberal, economically liberal than the SDP's, but you can disagree with me on that. I think both Reform UK and Reclaim are doubtful about the twisted science. So the British government claimed to follow the science, but it wasn't good science. And so Richard Tice said specifically he would bring data to lockdown or COVID policy, bring data, which is to say the government has not used data. It's used a lot of sort of what you might characterize as knee-jerk reactions and overcompensations. So just briefly, you don't have to take the opportunity, but is there anything you want to add or to differentiate the SDP's position on lockdown specifically from the other anti-lockdown parties, Reform UK and Reclaim?
Just to reiterate, really, that the grounds, the fundamentals of our arguments have been, communitarian and utilitarian. I've observed, I mean, in Reform's case, I think I have to say, sorry to point this out, but their conversion to being skeptical is reasonably late. We've been more consistent on that. If you look on certainly Nigel Farage's comments in the summer were pro-lockdown and pro more stringent lockdown. So it was a sort of a turn. I don't know why they made the turn or whatever, but they certainly did. On Lawrence Fox's position, I think Lawrence is a valuable, genuine and sincere campaigner on free speech and liberty. And it's not surprising that his approach is driven by liberty. But as I say, ours is not that ours isn't, but I don't think that's the first order thing. I think it is important, but it's when, to use a communitarian example in lockdown, public houses are a very, very vital part of our social infrastructure and our sort of historical social infrastructure. A lot of free speech started in the English tradition in the pub. Now it's a basic thing. It's part of the architecture of what we have. Now, to be indifferent about a policy that is going to probably reduce the number of pubs from something like 47,000, could go down to 30,000 after this. It's in real trouble. And by the way, their association and by action, they demonstrated in the summer that they could trade safely. They did what the government asked of them. They traded safely on the figures because viral spread in the summer was not through open pubs and restaurants, just wasn't on the data. It was in other places. They demonstrated they could do it. The evidence was in, and then they got shut down. But the consequence, the long-term consequence of losing those public places, communitarian places, is huge. So I think we need to think about that. Certainly, I wrote a piece for Spiked because Spiked are sort of friends with us, but we disagree. I mean, they're very, very libertarian, and we're not really. But I wrote a piece for them in defending the communitarian approach to being skeptical of the lockdown, and it went down pretty well.
Yeah. Well, thank you, William. So we have just a couple more questions for you. So let's talk about your electoral prospects here. Immediately, you're standing some candidates in the May elections. But as you've mentioned earlier, you have a national ambition to reform the whole electoral system, to go to proportional representation, which would benefit small parties such as the SDP. However, until you get PR, it's very difficult for small parties to make an impact, at least at the national level. So what's your strategy for success in an electoral system that discriminates against small parties like yourself?
It's a good question. Firstly, we are realistic. We know, in my own life, I know how difficult it's been, because, you could argue if the first iteration of the SDP did succeed in changing the system, with a former foreign secretary and a former home secretary and a chancellor and education secretary and lots of momentum, why would you think we could do it now? But I would argue that it still requires doing. If you think you're well governed by the duopoly, then you need to have a little closer look at it. So if you think you're right about that, then I think it's better to light a candle than to curse the darkness. So that's the first thing. We are realists. We're not. I think this is a very, very long-term project. But the first plus to it is just getting the philosophy right and having beliefs. You'd be astonished how they are broad churches, our opponents, and sometimes, in the Lib Dems case, completely incoherent. But, actually knowing what you're about, knowing what you're trying to achieve, and if you've thought it out, that's a major advantage. So it's early days for us. I think, again, we're realistic. I don't actually believe, I'm a sort of an attritionalist by nature. I don't think, and we get big boosts, we have had big boosts when, people like Giles Fraser and Rod and Patrick joined us. They're very welcome. We're looking for more. But I think the realistic, I don't think there's going to be a resurgence next year that puts us into a position of winning parliamentary seats or anything. I'm totally realistic about that. I think the model is actually the Green Party, funnily enough, which, as you're probably old enough to remember, the Ecology Party in the 70s. There isn't a substitute. There is not a substitute for building your branches, building your regional parties and your organizations, contesting council seats, and doing the hard work. There really isn't a substitute for that. And basically that's what we're doing. As I say, I think we do have a distinct advantage in that I don't think there's room. You can speak to Matt Goodwin about this, but I don't think there's political room. There's no room at the end for, something like the Reform Party necessarily. They want to reform, that's good, but it's Thatcherite economics, and I don't think that's the answer. And I don't think there's mass public support for that anyway. So if you look at where the political gap is in British politics, we're right on it. The real divide in British politics is between sort of social liberals and communitarians and patriots and people that are indifferent to that. So I think that's where the gap is. And I've long joked with people that if there were an equivalent of political Pepsi test, blind testing of our ideas and what we believe in, actually we win it. That's sort of true. The challenge is how you get it from the first stages of what we're doing to national recognition. But we have achieved a lot. 2 years ago, even most of the political commentators and writers and most people in the political universe didn't know we were here. And now they do, the sort of core politicos do, and our challenge is to bring it to the general public.
Well said, thank you. So, William, this is the last question. It sort of builds on my previous question, which is, if the SDP cannot make the changes it wants through the electoral system, in other words, through representation of its electorate, would you be satisfied? And I suppose I'll have to use you in both senses, you personally and the party. Would you be satisfied if the other parties adopted your platform? Yes, I think this is something that goes all the way back. It's not about particular entities, although I obviously have a deep affection for the SDP historically and my involvement in it. And I suppose that, to be honest, that does drive part of it. But no, it's what happens that counts. It's what happens to the country and the decisions that are made and so on. That's really the important thing.
I don't know of another vehicle that believes quite in our particular type of politics, so I don't know who else would do it in that sense. As to whether we've influenced, we actually, funnily enough, we have already, partly because the new declaration, which I wrote a couple of years ago and sort of kicked it off again, in the political sphere was widely read. And I know for a fact, quite a few people that advise Boris Johnson have read it and are all over it. So you see it cropping up occasionally in some of the language that's used. But I'd say it again, it's better if you believe it,
Yeah, well said. I think that's a good place to end. William, I'm going to thank you for the time you've spent talking with me. I don't necessarily agree with all your politics, but I agree with a lot. But more importantly, I've enjoyed talking with you, and I respect your intellect, your intellectual basis for your politics, which is too rare these days. And I also respect your motivations. So I wish you well, and I very much appreciate your time, sir. Thank you.
It's very cool. Thank you, Bruce. Thanks for the opportunity and all the best. Thank you. Cheers.
Thank you.